Well, hi, Martha.
Hi, Gavin. I'm so happy to be here, and we're in Gavin's hometown, so I especially appreciate being able to be here with you.
I know this is fun for our audience members. I'll say that Martha and I have been seeing a bit of each other lately because we did a joint reading presentation at a bookstore in Raleigh just last Wednesday. And so we had this fantastic conversation about all things dance and writing and fiction and memoir and got really into it. And so I'm eager to kind of get back into some of that today. But I want to start off by asking you to just give us a little bit of a synopsis and background about Three Muses, which is your novel. Um, as a dancer, anytime I read something that has anything to do with dance or ballet, I'm just like really compelled by it and really fascinated by it. And in your novel, there's so many intersecting components of the characters' lives that all just seem to revolve and circulate around the ballet. And so would you please tell us a little bit about Three Muses?
Sure, and I just wanted to thank Malaprops for having us, and Patricia and Stephanie for being here, and Gavin, who I think might be three different people based on her schedule, but it's wonderful to be here. So my novel is called Three Muses, and the title and the framing of the novel come from a strand of Greek mythology in which instead of the usual nine muses that we might be more familiar with, there are only three muses, and those three are song, discipline, and memory. And those three themes frame up the book. The book is a love story between John Curtin and Katya Simonova. John was born Janko Stein in Mainz, Germany, and is rounded up during the Holocaust with his family. And as they're in line for the gas chamber, his mother saves his life by saying to the SS officer that he can sing. So he is brought to the commandant's house and he survives the camp by singing for his family's killer, which presents him with a very large trauma and conflict around music and singing in general. He makes it to America, becomes a psychiatrist. He goes to the ballet in Paris. He's given a ticket to the ballet in Paris. And he falls in love with a ballerina, which, as a psychiatrist, he knows isn't really very that smart. He's watching a stage and he knows it. But for him, falling in love with a ballerina is just about the biggest conflict he could have because she can't work without music or song. So John is loosely associated with song. This ballerina is named Katya Simonova. She grew up in Queens. Her name was Catherine Silman. She's involved in a difficult, abusive relationship with her choreographer, who's named Boris Yanikov. And Boris renames her with a big fancy Russian name to be Katya Simonova. The third muse is memory, and we can talk about that maybe a little later. Very powerful muse.
Yeah. Um, as I said a minute ago, as a dancer reading any book that has any dance element in it, I am really interested in how ballet and dance is depicted and portrayed, and particularly the inner workings of the dancer characters, how those are expressed. And, the book that I just wrote is a memoir. So it was easy for me to get inside the character's head because it is my own head. And can you tell us how you, as a novelist and as not a professional dancer yourself, how did you get inside your artist characters, mindsets?
Well, I love this question, but I do have to correct the record. I don't think it was easy for you, and I
Oh,
cannot say enough about Gavin Larsen's memoir, Being a Ballerina, which I just adore. I don't think it's easy for any of us to render what's such an ephemeral, sort of temporary art form onto the page, which has a lot more permanence. I studied ballet as a child, and I definitely learned the whole bar routine and the workout and really fell in love with it. Unlike Gavin, I had no talent. But part of my ballet education was the privilege of watching a professional company dance. So they would be rehearsing before I came into class. And all of those things were extremely imprinted on me, even though I was very young. I stopped dancing seriously probably at age 12 or 13. Um, So your question is, how did I get in her head, basically? Well, I'm really interested in this question because several editors along the way kept saying, I don't understand why Katya loves ballet. And that question bothered me a lot because I always understood that she loved it, and I was sort of irritated about how am I going to express this, because you can't just assert someone loves ballet. Readers are smart and they need some evidence. So I decided, and also, how can we answer the question about why we love anything? So the way that I answered that question was to take the reader inside the studio, the classroom, not so much less rehearsal and more the classroom, where ballet dancers throughout their entire careers have to take class every day, and just put Katya through her paces, the actual warm-ups, the bar exercises, and try to get in her head about what she felt, what she was feeling. And she just gets so much joy from the feeling of her muscles warming up and her legs and arms getting limber, and also from the closing out of the outside world. Katya's mother was killed when she was 7 by a car accident, and so the ballet studio for Katya is a place of great peace and sanctuary.
Right. That is so relatable to me as a dancer, that it's like so spot on. The ballet studio really is a sanctuary. And I think it's common, there's like a common misperception that it's a trap, and that, ballet becomes kind of like a manipulative force holding a dancer in its sway, but it's really the opposite. I mean, it's really the dancer who's using that world to grow and to be their fullest version of themselves. I'm wondering if this would be a good juncture for you to read a passage that gives us a taste of Katya.
Thank you. So I'm going to read this passage, and a little later I'm going to read a passage about John. But both of these passages are the same scene, written from different perspectives. So Katya is about to go on, this is very early in the novel, she's about to go on stage in Paris, at the Paris Opera, and she's dancing in the ballet, which is called Three Muses. She's getting ready to get on stage, and she's a little nervous, and John is in the audience, and somehow she has a sense of that. So we'll start with her backstage. Lars, playing the old faun, stood with Katya, readying their entrance. Adjusting his horns, he whispered ballet's favorite good luck term, "Merde, Muse of Discipline." "Thanks, Lars. You too." Mr. Yanikoff paced the opposite wing, scowling. Head down, he gave the impression that his company had just suffered appalling notices, and not that they were instead poised for opening night before the cream of Paris. Katya felt an imperative to gather her forces and ignore him. She fingered her tutu netting and shook out first her right leg and then her left. Three muses in Paris. Katya was relieved for the vast physical expanse separating her from her choreographer. And the expanse between Katya and Mama? Mama had never even seen Katya dance. Her absence was enveloping. A reminder that despite being embedded in the company, and despite Mr. Yanikoff, who had willed Katya the stage, conferred on her this feast, Katya danced through life alone. Her memories had grown hazy with time, a few: Mama's toothy grin when she handed her daughter her school lunchbox, Mama's throaty laugh, her butterscotch house dress with the white rickrack. For years, Katya kept up an ongoing monologue addressed heavenward, as if her soliloquies could coat the void that was Mama. "Places," the stage manager called. Katya made a last adjustment to the ribbon on her right pointe shoe and felt the house, feverish with anticipation. Act 1 began. Katya leapt on stage, parting the dancers as if her luminous heat would grill them alive. To dance was to live, to till motion, to impart the joy that welled up every time she took to the stage, her body the vehicle for her art. The lights were blinding. As the music intensified, she skimmed the energy from the audience to reach another dimension. Transcending reason, she danced through raw emotion and spun toward a new center. She had an eerie sense that someone out there had understood her, that she had spoken directly and been heard, that her endless labors had been worth it, the blisters, the pain, the exhaustion, the interminable practice, to dance the muse of discipline, to feel what she felt.
That's beautiful.
Thank you.
As you're reading that, I had a thought that I hadn't even occurred to me when I read the book the first time, which is that so Katya, like most dancers, finds freedom in dancing, that the stage is her freedom, her power. And John, through his art form, he did find freedom too, physical freedom, away from being, imprisoned basically, but then it entrapped him. He found, song gave him freedom, but then it entrapped him for life, the memory of it. And that's such an interesting, juxtaposition between those two characters. And
So,
yeah.
well, I have a couple of thoughts about that. One is, and I was thinking about this while we were just, chatting behind stage. Um, John, so song and music, first of all, is something that, as you were saying about John, it gives us great joy, but many of us have very melancholy associations with music. It might be, so if it's associated with a sad time of your life, music can be very, very powerful and evocative and triggering. But while we were talking about the warm up and the importance of the classroom and this sanctuary feeling of the classroom, I was thinking the discipline is actually fairly liberating because you're given a set of guardrails and you can just sort of fall into it. And the routine itself is actually freeing. I know that sounds contradictory, but I don't think that it is.
No, that's absolutely true, 100% true. And it's hard for a lot of people to understand who
Yes.
haven't, maybe pursued a discipline, whether it's dance or music or a sport or any sort of anything. The guardrail analogy is perfect. That's exactly right. It gives you safety in the structure and it gives you a foundation from which you can be completely free. And yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I thought I studied music quite seriously through college, and we had 2 years of counterpoint, which was very, very rigorous, very strict rules about how classical compositions are written. And what I realized, it was a real light bulb moment, is that Mozart knew all of this. He couldn't have written what he wrote without this. And he couldn't have broken the rules and reached his creative peak without knowing all the rules.
Right. So true. Yeah. I wonder, can you tell us a little bit about John's character now? Because I mean, I was very interested, of course, in Katya because I've, sort of looking for parallels between her life and mine. But the first part of the book where you describe John's experience, well, he was Yanko then, but as a child in the camp and singing for the commander. And oh my gosh, it was so gripping. All of those chapters during the Holocaust was just so gripping. And it's really quite amazing that he grew up into an adult and became a psychiatrist and had to analyze himself and heal himself in order to heal others. And can you tell us more about his character development and
Sure.
maybe a little bit about him?
I mean, unlike Katya, who grew up in this family without a mother, and her father had to work all the time, so she came from a rather lonely home. John actually came from a totally intact family with loving parents. He had a little brother, which was disrupted by external forces. And so he has this grounding of a huge amount of love in his life. He says to himself as an adult, he just had a habit of losing it. And when he is finally, he's a child in the camp, sort of age 11 to 15. And when he finally, he hasn't even contemplated that his mother and brother may have been murdered until the camp is liberated. And then he's old enough to sort of take in what was in front of his face the whole time, basically. When he gets to New York, he is adopted by a very, very loving couple, Selma and Barney, who have lost their only child, a son, who was a soldier in the Battle of Sicily. And so they want to give John everything that their son would have had, which is to stake John to medical school. And through a random conversation, he becomes a psychiatrist. A neighbor says, you have so much pain in your life, you might want to think about becoming a psychiatrist. And the implication is, if you can heal yourself, you may be able to help heal others. And one thing that I thought was really important to communicate is that John came from a loving family and landed completely on his feet in New York in an incredibly loving, embracing family, was given everything in America. But the level of loss and trauma that he has will never heal. So it's a question of learning for him, of learning how to manage his, I mean, I guess nowadays we would say trauma or PTSD, but also he wants to give back. He knows that he's a rare in having survived this, and he wants to give back some of what he's been given to the world. So he's a very loving person and also troubled.
Mm-hmm. Is there a section you wouldn't mind reading to
Sure.
depict that?
Sure. So it's the same scene in that John is given this ticket to the ballet at this conference in Paris. He doesn't want to go, but he has to because it's the boss's wife who's given it to him. So this is where he's sitting down in his seat and he's about to watch the curtain rise. The music began, slow, plangent tones paced to the speed of a man's forward tread. The chorus entered, deep and serious and sad, as if their voices had taken the measure of John's memory. The curtain lifted on snow-covered mountain against an aqua sea, a scene to conjure myth. Dancers in blue and green leapt in unison, legs like arrows, arms overhead. They fell into lines fracturing like kaleidoscope patterns or forms in opposing mirrors. Overcome by jet lag, John dozed off. He was in his family's Mainz living room, Mutti darning socks, Papa with his pipe, left thumb over the bowl, right poised to cock a silver lighter. Lopsided smoke rings meandered toward the ceiling. A few more puffs before the pipe hung limply from Papa's mouth as he grew increasingly absorbed in the evening paper. Rubbing his eyes, John slowly woke up. He knew the music. After dinner, when Yanko's schoolwork was finished and he was getting drowsy, Papa had played it on the gramophone. If Yanko was lucky, he'd be permitted a few minutes to sit with the grown-ups before Mutti declared bedtime. The chorus sang with veneration, permeating the hall the way the smell of Mutti's bubbling apple strudel filled her kitchen, or the first peaty draughts of Papa's pipe suffused the living room. John was flooded with grief. The music a piercing shorthand for what was gone. All of them. Mutti, Papa, even little Max, who hadn't been born until later. John had not thought about this music in decades, if ever. He recalled Papa starting the gramophone as Mutti settled into the horsehair sofa with her sewing kit. Yanko was growing so fast, Mutti had to let out the hems of his trousers. The sewing kit was black walnut, the varnish on the edges smoothed from use. It was from Yanko's grandmother. The orchestra moved with gravity and purpose, music as familiar as childhood. Now it was named Mozart's Requiem. Not only the people and the place, but this too had been stolen. John didn't need to stay. Dr. and Mrs. Leventhal would understand. Searching for the quickest exit, John struggled to call up something, anything to stanch his anguish. What value were his sessions with his training psychiatrist? Dr. Roth was useless. None of the patrons around John budged. He would be imprisoned here until the end of the act. Making another effort, he took a deep breath to marshal his defenses. And then, a lone ballerina sheathed in white floated toward center stage. The audience greeted her with shouts of "Brava!" She was the muse of discipline. She cut through the whirling dancers with precision and exactitude. John had never seen anyone so exquisite. She was a reverie, an evocation of grace. Each fluttering arm motion dissipated his pain. Her dancing ordered the music, rendered it alluring. He strained left as she exited, as if by craning his neck he could follow her. She spun in duo with the muse of song, summoning peace and beauty. Together the two made harmony. Their playfulness lightened John's mood. He glowed like a man feeling desire for the first time.
Wow. I have to say, I danced the ballet once to Mozart's Requiem, and that it sure is powerful. To listen to
I only recently found out there was such a ballet. So I think I've talked to you about. I just have submitted a review for this extraordinary book by the New Yorker dance critic named Jennifer Homans. It's about George Balanchine. It's coming out in a couple weeks. And I never knew it until I read that book. So was it a Balanchine ballet? The book?
No, actually, I didn't dance the Balanchine
Yeah.
ballet. When I was in Pacific Northwest Ballet, we did we had a piece was choreographed to that piece too.
So
So I was
interesting. Who choreographed it?
the director of the company at the time did.
Interesting.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I don't think it was done. I think it was like a one-time only thing, so it
Hmm.
didn't go down in
Hmm.
history. But yeah.
Interesting.
That kind of leads into I'm curious what kind of ballet research you did, because you are very specific in describing the choreography that that you fictionalize choreography, but you're very specific about it, and it's very evocative the way you depict these. And what kind of research did you do when you were writing or before writing?
Well, I kind of have been doing research my whole life because I've always gone to the ballet sort of through thick and thin. I mean, I've always made it a practice. So I've really seen a lot, and I feel like my early training helped me to be an observer. And then, I mean, even as a really young child, I always read ballet reviews in the newspaper, which was at that time in paper, and I paid a lot of attention, particularly to what was going on at the New York City Ballet. But I mean, I'm from Philly, so paying attention to the Pennsylvania Ballet, which is now called the Philadelphia Ballet. But here in Washington, D.C., where I live, everybody comes. So where you used to dance, Pacific Northwest Ballet, the Boston Ballet, Houston, San Francisco. I mean, we have a really, a Suzanne Farrell company. We have a really rich ballet scene here. So that's, I mean, I do feel that's part of my research, and I always wanted to, still do. I always sit above. I don't like sitting in the orchestra because it is the patterns I find totally enchanting. And I
Yeah,
feel like if you're in the orchestra, you can't see that. I prefer to be somewhat higher.
right.
So I think it's probably true that a lot of my descriptions were from on high. I just realized like the choreographer doesn't see it that way. They're on the same level as the dancers, but I always like experiencing it a little bit above. I
Yeah.
did do some reading. I did do some specific checking. Um, of certain things as I was going along, which is the beauty of the internet for those of us who are old enough to remember life pre-internet. It's just unbelievable what you can find. And I need this specific thing at this specific time, and I need to know what street the Paris Opera's on, and that kind of thing. So I did do specific research along the way.
Yeah, cool. It's interesting. Balanchine is actually famous for taking great pride in the formations of the dancers when he was choreographing, especially the corps de ballet, and making these incredible geometric patterns and shifting. And it's absolute genius if you are able to watch it from watch one of his ballets from a vantage point where you can see those formations, and it's being done well, so they're very clear. It's like incredible. It's absolutely incredible visual.
So
Um,
I would love to ask you whether have you been in the corps dancing any of that, because as a dancer it must be really, must really have to concentrate because it's so precise. Like, what is that experience like?
It's amazing. When I was in Pacific Northwest Ballet, we did a ton of Balanchine ballets. And that was very early in my career. I was 17, 18, 19, 20, 21 years old. And so I was in the corps de ballet. And Francia Russell, who was the co-artistic director at the time, she's a Balanchine repetiteur. And so she would stage these iconic Balanchine works on us, and I was always in the ensemble. And I remember so vividly the way she would teach us, like the Choir of Serenade or Theme and Variations and Symphony in C and the Four Temperaments and oh my gosh, so many Western Symphony, Stars and Stripes. And her brain is like a steel trap, and being taught and memorizing the shapes and the lines and the formations and the placement it's very mathematic, and it's incredibly, for me, fun. I loved it. And it's so satisfying because you have this spot and then you make a 45-degree turn and you do this person on count 5, and then you turn to your right and you line up on the diagonal and you're here for a 12, and then you turn to your left on a 4 and you find this new line and line. You learn so much about spatial awareness, about proprioception. I mean, it also brings to mind all the many comparisons that are made between ballet and the military, the
Hmm.
types of the formations and the regimentation. And it's very true in that way. I mean, we can stay in line as well as any soldier marching in any formation, any regiment.
It's
And
really
we can do
interesting.
it on the music too.
I mean, it speaks to the incredible focus that's necessary. You can't space out. Basically, you've got to be really, really focused.
Incredible folk and a credible awareness,
Yeah.
spatial awareness. And this, we call it you have to have eyes on the back of your head, because to be in the corps de ballet, you have to know where everyone is around you and where they're moving and when they're about to move, so that you can shift with them. And if you're lining up behind someone, you are, I mean, watching them, yes, but you're just like you in tune with them. And you have to move exactly with them. It's like that game that sometimes kids play, like mirror. We stand across from each other and you mirror each other's movements. You get incredibly good at that. And
So
I found it incredibly satisfying. And that's what makes, watching those ballets so magical, I think.
it's so interesting. I mean, my instrument is viola, and I played it for many, many years. And I think the same thing is true if you watch a small group, a string quartet on stage. It doesn't look like people are looking at each other, but you have to be right with them, and you're constantly listening to other three players and making adjustments that I think the audience don't always perceive that you're doing that, but otherwise it can't work, basically. What was
Exactly.
the term that you used?
Oh,
Proprioception?
proprioception, which
Never
is
heard that.
your body's ability to understand where it is in space.
Hmm.
Kind of how you can hold yourself upright and move and balance based. I mean, I'm sure there are scientists and therapists out there, physical therapists, who are going, no, that's not the right definition at all. But to me, it's about your ability to kind of keep yourself right
Hmm.
in space.
Fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's really, I mean, dancers just have this very, very heightened sensitivity to what's around them, especially other people. And that, I mean, I've been retired for 10 years and I still have that when I'm just in a room with people or walking down the
Hmm.
street, this heightened awareness of like where people are and their movements and
Hmm.
when they're moving and when they're shifting.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
And then I think, it, well, when I first came to fiction writing, my primary goal is to get music on the page, and I'm extremely focused on the sound of words and that sound together and the rhythm. And I mean, I think that a dancer has to internalize the rhythm. You can't be just, there's so much going on, but you have to be one with the rhythm. And I think that's also part of the art.
Yeah. Oh, it's so true. It's so true.
Yeah.
You become musical by learning how to count the music and then doing steps on certain counts, but then you
Mhm.
become artistic
Mhm.
by internalizing that and
Mhm.
learning how to kind of massage it and nuance it. And actually, now that I'm a writer, I find that same satisfaction in manipulating words.
Yeah.
And I think writers are dancers in that way. I mean, I think you're a dancer by the way you write, the way you massage and manipulate the words and choreograph with the words. Do you feel that at all?
I love that. I do. I call it like sliding words around the page. And, I have adult children, but when they were home, when my husband in the house, apparently I'm constantly up here in my study, constantly talking to myself because you can, I just, it just has to sound right. And it takes a long time to get a sentence to sound right. And I don't know what that is. And I forget who this is, a really famous poet who was asked, how do you know when the poem is done? And I think the answer was when taking out a word would ruin the poem, basically, when every word is essential. And I try to write fiction that way. And it's so interesting to talk about choreography. I definitely feel that. I mean, I'm not a visual person. Um, I'm not very visual in like noticing decorations or stuff like that. But when I'm writing, there's a lot of vision in here about the shape of the paragraph and the shape of the sentence and where's the white space on the page and should there be white space. It's really, really, and this sort of structural framework kind of thing that I think a choreographer has to think about.
Yeah, very similar, very similar.
Yeah.
And actually, I wanted to ask you about your writing process a bit because, you and I are both first-time authors, but you have
Yes.
been a writer a lot longer than I have, and you've been such a prolific critic and commentator and essayist. So when you're writing your fiction, do you think, like, did you find that you were kind of writing it with a reviewer's eye? I mean, were you thinking about how a reviewer would perceive it as you were writing?
I I don't think so. Like I used to make all these bright lines, like my day job is social justice. Then I'd run home and write book reviews. And fiction. So my fiction practice is a little hard to describe because it's quite chaotic at the moment. Because launching my novel has been a labor of love, but it's a big labor. So I have to get in what I can only call the zone, which I think is something like being in a ballet studio. I've often called it my church, which is an odd thing to say for a nice Jewish girl. I have to get in church and get in the zone. It has to be really quiet. I used to listen to music. I no longer listen to music because it affects my emotional framework, and then out comes sentimental drivel. And so it has to be silent, and so I can hear what's going on, and I just get in this like Zen space where I kind of become the character. It took me years to get here, but we see both John and Katya when they were small children, and I just had to be those children and think, well, they can't know this, and they can't know that. What does a child think? So it's on really good days, I'm in an altered state. Unfortunately, it's really hard to do. We have many, many, many demands on our time, and I think it's hard to write in short chunks. I mean, we all have to do it, especially when I'm reviewing a book. I may only have 20 minutes to do, a certain section, and I'll have to come back to it. But for fiction, I like big fat periods of time so I can kind of get into that zone.
Yeah, yeah. Did you find that you were, at any point thinking about how it might be reviewed since you are a reviewer yourself?
It's so interesting. I don't recall that. Of course, I think about what criticisms people will have and whether they'll like it, and will people want to buy it, and can they understand what I'm talking about? And um, I didn't know what to think about other people reading it. I mean, I've been trying, Gavin knows this, I've been trying to get a book published for 20 years. So the idea of my book being in other people's hands is still extremely surreal to me. That
I know.
people are reading my work and understanding it. It's this overwhelming feeling. I really haven't taken it in, to be honest.
Yeah.
It's still amazing. So I don't know that I could even get to that place of thinking about critics.
Yeah. Yeah. I know what you mean.
Yeah.
Yeah, you pour yourself out there onto the page, and then and you have to do that. I mean, it can't be good unless it's honest and it's
Right.
true. And then all of a sudden you're like, oh my gosh, I was really honest and really real, and now it's out there for the world.
Exactly. And then when somebody reads it, like somebody like you is such a good reader, or other folks who have written about it, and they get what you're doing, it's almost a spiritual experience. It's really extraordinary.
It
I mean,
really is.
I felt that way when I read your book. I felt like it was really speaking to me. It just made all the sense. And as one thing I do when I read, I'm very, very conscious of structure, to my earlier point about sort of visualizing the words on the page. And I could tell as soon as I read your book that it was really difficult to structure it. But as a reader, it flows so smoothly. And I thought, I don't know how much work went into that to make it flow so smoothly, because it's like dusting. If you don't dust, it's very obvious. But if you dust, it shouldn't be obvious, right?
Right, right. That's a nice analogy.
Yes.
Yeah, very true. Very true. I have one more question about your book itself, about Three Muses. And this is kind of going back to the research and the choreographic process. Again, coming at it as a ballet dancer, when I even read the title before I even started, I thought Three Muses, that's got to be based on Balanchine's ballet Apollo.
It's really interesting. No is the answer to that. I've seen
Which
it.
I figured out as soon as I started reading.
Yeah, and I just read a huge amount about Apollo, and I was really interested. So no, and I guess what I would say is I started out not choreographing my own stuff. I started out with Swan Lake as the center of this book. I mean, I am, along with the rest of humanity, it is my favorite ballet. I can't help it that it's popular. And I mean, I just love it. I love the music. I love everything about it. I probably spent, it took me 10, 12 years to write this book. I probably spent the first 2, 3 years really trying to get to know Swan Lake and centering it in the book. And then I finally realized, as I got a sharper critical eye on my own work, it's not in service of the story. It's a different story, and it's going to distract from what I'm trying to do. And so then I realized I have to just make this up myself so I can make sure everything is in sync in terms of the plot and the characters.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. What's it like working in historical fiction, in that genre? And, creating that, it strikes me as such a incredibly difficult task to put on yourself.
So it's really interesting. I never thought of this book as historical fiction. It is being marketed that way. And I understand why, because it definitely takes place in a definite period of history with real historical events. So I have two different answers. One is that I had to jettison the things that I could not get answers to. So I just talked about jettisoning Swan Lake. I had John is a psychiatrist, and I had him doing his training at Bellevue Hospital in New York. And then I went down a lot of rabbit holes trying to figure out, what did the hospital look like? What was the flooring like? What were the offices like? I couldn't get what I needed. So then I fictionalized. That's the nice thing about being a fiction writer. You're just like, oh, I'll make it up. So I tried to hew to some of the things I had learned, but I had to make up the name of the hospital because I thought there's going to be some reader out there who remembers Bellevue during the 50s and 60s, and they're going to be stuck on whatever I said. So to some extent, to actually keeping with history, I had to make some things up so as not to be inaccurate. I did really an enormous amount of work around Kennedy, the Kennedy era, and also because of the bulk of the activity in this book takes place in 1963, actually before the assassination. And then I had, I don't know, 40, 50 pages about the Kennedy funeral, which I spent I don't know how long on, watching videos and looking where people were placed, and that famous horse with the backward boot on it. I really wanted in there. I want to know the music. And it all ended up on the cutting room floor. So that's one answer to how you write historical fiction. You go down a lot of rabbit holes, write a lot of stuff, and then it gets jettisoned. But I also want to be extremely careful of speech and speech patterns, which were different in the 1950s. My parents were young adults in the 50s, so I tried to capture some of their speech and some of their expressions. And also, there are just a lot of expressions that have come into use now which are unheard of. So I try to be really conscious of what, getting rid of slang or just everyday expressions that we might use in 2022 that wouldn't have been appropriate
Yeah,
or even around at that time.
yeah, yeah. I mean, I think the line between, fiction, nonfiction, or fiction and memoir, it can be blurry sometimes.
Yeah.
And I mean, I know for me, it's what I wrote is ostensibly a memoir, but I turned to a fictionalized tone and fictionalized approach for some parts of it so that I could be free. I could feel brave enough, I could kind of
Yes.
hide behind that.
Yeah.
Wondering if there's any of you, is there any autobiography, is there any memoir in your novel?
So I think emotional there's emotional memory, and I definitely called upon the emotional kind of euphoria that I have had when I was dancing. I mean, I remembered that just so clearly.
Mhm.
And some of the grief, and sadness. I mean, I knew a lot of Holocaust survivors, was close to a few of them. I've heard the stories, and I felt I'd internalized a lot of the grief. And that grief is important to me. I think we not, I don't know how to say this without saying really weird, but it undervalue it as a society. We don't appreciate here in America the necessity of grief
Yeah,
and what it means in our lives. And that was incredibly emotional and personal for me.
yeah, I'm sure. Yeah. I'm wondering if there are any audience questions.
Let's get started with some questions. What a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Martha, for speaking so eloquently about your book and all of the elements that went into creating it. A question about that sort of builds on Gavin's question about writing what may be kind of a genre defying idea of historical fiction. When you originally started this book, where did it start, and how much did that deviate or reflect where it ended up? And I only asked this because I was reading an interview with Ian McEwan about atonement, and he said it started out as science fiction, and I mean my eyebrows went all the way up to the ceiling because I could hardly imagine atonement being science fiction. So if you care to share that, it may not have been that wide of a deviation, but where did it start for you?
I know where it started. It's just so weird because it's not in the book. I had a vision of a former ballet dancer watching her son play basketball, and what I heard was that thump, thump, thump. And in this book, Katya never has a child, and there was no basketball. I don't know. That's how she like appeared, and there were a lot of children in this book. My first vision of John was as a father of two children, and that's not who he is in this book. And I still don't understand what to do with those children. I mean, I wrote a lot about John and his children, and what I found was the children start to take over the novel, and I didn't want it to be about them, so I had to literally kill my darlings. But I also still don't even understand it. I mean, some people are more some fiction writers are more rational. They have a more rational process. Mine is apparently very irrational and intuitive, organic. So I had the feel for the characters, but they turned out to be really different from as I first saw them.
And Gavin touched on this too. Your work as a book reviewer is something that some people are anxious to find out what's the review, what do the critics say, and then others are like, oi, oh, what? Yikes, right?
Yeah.
And so you're now you're in two worlds.
Yeah.
And so what does it take to be, what's the kind of critic that you are? What does it take to be an effective book reviewer or critic?
So early on when I started reviewing, which was almost around this time I started this book, it was around 2011, end of 2010, 2011. I went to a conference and I heard 3 book critics for the Washington Post speaking, and they said that they envisioned their jobs as really introducing wonderful books to readers, to bring joy, transmit their joy in reading, and get readers excited about books. And I decided that is really the best description I can think of. So I'm not nasty, or I try not to be. And the 2 or 3 times when I have felt like I really have to trash this book, it's horrible, I have withdrawn. I don't want to write that review. I've just stepped aside. So I look for the positive. I think now that I've written a book, and I know how hard it is to do, so I do always want to look for the positive, and I want to be writing about observations that I might have that you're not reading on the book jacket. So I think this is true for most reviewers. You don't want to spend too much time on plot. I always want to talk about books that I feel are maybe related or resonant. I often put that in a book review where this person might resonate with a book that's already out. And I try to identify, without being too obvious, but what kind of readers might want to read this book. For example, I'm currently reviewing a book by Franklin Thomas, who was a very prominent Black intellectual and activist. And he was the first Black president of the Ford Foundation. He had a huge history, did a million things. And I realized I reading it, I think it is. I realize his trajectory is very much the trajectory of the 20th century of how somebody from a humble background from Bed-Stuy Bedford-Stuyvesant neighborhood in New York makes it into the upper echelons of power. He was also hugely involved in South African negotiations, post-apartheid, pre-apartheid, or during apartheid. And so I think well, who would like this? And I think be somebody who's really interested in the 20th century and what that kind of granular feeling of one person's trajectory. So that's just a concrete example.
Question for the two of you. There's a lot of our audience members are aspiring writers, or they've started writing something. What do you suggest as building on the concrete example? Was there a moment in your writing where you were stuck? How did you become unstuck? Martha, I'll go to you first, and then Gavin.
Okay, so you might ask, is there a moment when I'm not stuck? But
okay.
Right. So,
like, how'd you get out of it?
I do have a really strong mantra about this, and it's simple: write what you can. I feel like all of us writers are really good at saying what we can't do. I can't do this, I can't do that. So I'm pretty rigorous about this. If I'm stuck, and I'm stuck very frequently, I just switch. So the thing is, I switched to a different. So the thing is, novels is you can just go to a different part of the novel. It's so if I know, like, okay, I'm stuck in scene A, but I have a sentence I want to add in scene B, I just move on. That has been the great benefit of book reviewing for me, because I do feel that writing begets writing, and writing is a craft no matter what you're writing, whether you're writing a memoir like Gavin or book review or a novel. So I switch back and forth when I'm really stuck on one project. I go to another. So that's my biggest advice: write what you can, because God knows we can say what we can't do very easily.
Wonderful. Gavin, what about you?
When I was writing my book, I can't say that I ever got stuck as like up against a wall, but I got really confused a number of times, and like I didn't know what direction I was supposed to be going in, and how it, and you were talking about the shaping of it and the structure of it a second ago, Martha. Like I got really confused about how the structure should go, and just felt like I was at sea drowning, and like just didn't know where to go. Like I knew I was sort of swimming, but I didn't know where I was going to go. I was like pedaling water. And I did not step away so much as just try to look at it from a different angle. I had other people look at it and sort of help me give some ideas. I just tried shifting things around and looking at it from a different like arrangement, because I wrote it as a series of pieces. I put it together as a puzzle at the end, which is not advisable and took a long time, is really confusing. So it was not like from the beginning to the end. I mean, I know most books are not written from the beginning to the end anyway, but I wrote mine like so piecemeal. It was ridiculous. And that's why it was really confusing to put together. But like Martha, I do two different kinds of writing. I do a ton of, well, currently right now, pretty much all I do is freelance journalism for different dance magazines, not criticism so much as, journalism, like, how-to articles and more informational pieces for Pointe Magazine and Dance Magazine, and interviews with dancers and artistic profiles and things like that. And like Martha just said, that's the way I keep my toolkit sharp. And that really, it kind of feeds me and fuels me to write anything else. It really helps me hone my craft and, learn more about structure and get better at it, and get better at sliding words around on the page, as you said.
Martha, question about what's next. You talk about this book took you a while, and some books take a while, and then some don't. What's next for you? Are you even thinking about that?
Oh yeah, I have a book that's currently looking for a home. It's a deep dive into the musical world of Philadelphia, where I'm from, and Philadelphia is a home of tremendous classical music with not only the Philadelphia Orchestra, but also Curtis Institute, which is a major training school for musicians. So that's looking for a publishing home. And I'm very far along. I hope to finish a first draft by January, February of a surreal novel, which is the basic premise is that a girl who is having her portrait painted gets stuck in the painting. So it's a big departure from stuff I've done before.
Well, now, see, it's not fair to Gavin because I asked her this the other day. So Gavin's like, see previous comment from Sunday, Patricia.
We didn't get to hear, so tell us.
Patricia, you can answer the question for me, can't you?
I could, but would it be fair? Would it be
No.
fair, Gavin?
No, the answer is I don't know what's next. I have a bunch of ideas and nothing is even fully formed enough or has been embarked upon far enough to even talk about publicly, even though I did tell Patricia a little bit about it.
Okay.
The two of us. But but there will be more. I mean, if there's power in this universe, I'll get something else out there eventually. But I will say that one thing I love about the kind of journalism I do is character studies and interviewing dancers and getting to know artists and like trying to get inside them and then tell their story from the inside out. So maybe that will figure into whatever I cobble together in book length form next.
Martha, question for you about influences. So you're really a unique author in that you've reviewed so many books. I mean, that's pretty staggering. So what do you have to step away from reading other books when you're kind of trying to do what you described as writing a big chunk, or can you read and what influences you? What do you have to shut out?
So I love this question. And so part of the question that Gavin asked me about research is I stopped reading anything about ballet during most of the time that I was writing this. So I actually had to leave stuff aside. I particularly didn't want to read ballet novels because I was really nervous about being influenced. But I think I'm less concerned about that now. But and at any rate, there's a lot that I didn't read and that came back after I had submitted the manuscript. When I talk about influences, my biggest influence were my parents. I feel that I really learned to write from them. I basically don't have any formal writing training. I am a lawyer and there's a lot of writing in law, but my parents were very serious about the written word, so I got a lot of it in the water supply. My mom was a professional editor and my dad was a lawyer, but he was a spectacular writer, and they were very, very rigorous in terms of at-home writing instructions. So that's probably my biggest influence. But that said, I think the biggest influence for me is good writing. I don't care where it is. If it can be in any format. I read fiction, nonfiction. I read everything. I like poetry. I love poetry, but I don't know enough about it. And I did take a poetry class last year just to try to learn more about it because I feel like the rigor that poetry has and the musicality is really, really stunning. So mostly I'm really influenced by good writing. And I haven't really worried about being influenced by books that I read that I review, because the stuff that I'm reviewing, I probably would never be writing. So I've never actually worried about that. And I mostly just take in all the good stuff.
Gavin, what about you? We're wrapping up here, but I'd love to hear the influences.
Just like Martha, I'm influenced by good writing. I mean, growing up, I'm from a sort of literary family too. My father is a writer and my mother was a book review editor. So, there were galleys all over the house and I was reading constantly. And when I got bit by the ballet bug at a 10, 11-year-old, I couldn't read enough books about ballet, memoirs, autobiographies, histories, everything, novels. And some of them were incredibly influential on me and remain so to this day. Tony Bentley's Winter Season completely planted the seed when I was like 12 years old. And it really inspired the format of my own book. So I'm very grateful to her. But yeah, I mean, I really internalize good writing wherever I read it. And I just somehow like memorize like the way those words are formed and shaped and way a piece is put together.
I really admire this idea of being surrounded by words and good writing. And I'm reminded of the movie Splendor in the Grass, where that part of Wordsworth's beautiful ode imitations of immortality is plucked to Natalie Wood's character recites part of that. And poetry, I think, Martha, since you've taken a class, you seem like you were influenced by that idea of that crafting of that the poet does.
I have a fantasy that I'm going to sit down and really try to write some poetry myself. I don't seem to get it at all as a writer, but I do feel it's an extraordinary art form. And when you read a poem and it takes so few words to say these huge concepts, I mean, they always blow my mind, really.
Well, if I can borrow metaphors from dance and say the choreography between the two of you in this conversation has been lovely, and it's been a pleasure to celebrate Three Muses. Congratulations, Martha Toll, for this wonderful debut novel. And I'm delighted that Gavin was here to talk with you about it, because the two of you evoked so many amazing images and ideas, and just created this great conversation. Congratulations, Martha. Thank you for being with us this evening and being in conversation with Gavin for Three Muses. And thank you, audience, for joining us.
And thank you, Patricia and Gavin and Malaprops. It's just and Stephanie. It's just been a beautiful evening. I can't thank you enough.
Good night, everyone. Thank you.